Hello everyone and welcome to this academic presentation. My name is Gloria Montiel and I will be talking about expanding horizons for students with dyslexia. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment for you to check in with yourselves. How are you feeling right now? What's going through your head? What's your state of mind? If you had to describe that in one single emoji, what would it be? Please share your emojis with me in the chat box. Today's session will be divided into 4 parts. First, we will talk about the definition of dyslexia, and we will look at the references about it. Then, we will talk about the impact of dyslexia in the ELT settings. As a third point, we will be talking about the strategies that you as a teacher can implement to support your students with dyslexia. There will be time for questions and answers, and I will share with you my references. Now, on to the first part of this session. What is dyslexia? If you have to go on with your experience, with the references that you have read, if you had to come up with a definition of dyslexia, what would it be? What words, what areas of knowledge would most commonly be involved? Share it with me in the chat box. All of the words that you have shared with me and your feedback and your input on the topic of dyslexia are very important. But I would like to take a moment now to consider what dyslexia is and what it feels like for students that have it. READ in 2009 conducted research, and right here on the slide you can see the answers of some of the students. It's very interesting to notice how a person that has dyslexia perceives their reality. Students define it as a problem transferring their knowledge into written work, frustration for not being able to complete tasks on time, wanting to read books but not being able to move past the first page, having a bad memory and being disorganized. But the one that has stuck with me the most because of its implications is the one that I'm showing you in this slide. The feeling of being different from everyone else. Can you imagine how hard it is for a student in school age to feel this way? That's the reason and the motivation behind this talk. According to the British Dyslexia Association, dyslexia is a specific learning difficulty that mainly affects the development of literacy and language-related skills. This is something that a lot of you mentioned in the chat box. It is characterized by difficulties specifically with phonological processing, rapid naming, working memory, processing speed, and the automatic development of skills. What's interesting about dyslexia is that these characteristics may not match up to an individual's other cognitive abilities. While the British Dyslexia Association defines dyslexia as a learning difficulty, in this session we will strive to use the terminology learning difference to highlight the fact that students with dyslexia simply learn differently. We need to understand, both teachers and learners, that dyslexia is not the result of brain damage or poor teaching. It appeared suddenly at a certain stage in the development of a learner, and it is probably genetic in origin. It is permanent, but it is not a disease, but rather a different way in which the brain processes some inputs. Dyslexia does not affect all of the abilities of a person, and learners with dyslexia often have average cognitive and social skills. However, they encounter specific difficulties in the following 3 areas. We will now move on to the second part of this academic presentation, and we will start thinking about the impact of dyslexia in ELT settings. Please look at the picture in your screen now. Is this an environment that you're familiar with? Have you taught classes in an environment like this? Even before the pandemic, this was a reality. What can you see? Tell me in the chat box. Let's start by challenging a little bit what we do every day in the classroom. How many of the activities set on the screen do you do in a regular class? How often do you integrate these activities into your lesson plans? You will see that there are some activities here, like reading out loud, taking dictation, taking notes, reading and summarizing, that have been part of your way of teaching, and they have probably been part of the way you were taught for a number of years. However, we have to start thinking about these activities a little bit closer. Regardless of the frequency with which you do these activities, you will find that there are 3 things that these activities have in common. You can see now in the slide that I have divided them into 2 groups. So think about the activities a little bit harder and see if you can identify the 3 factors that all of the activities have in common. Tell me your thoughts in the chat box. The 9 tasks in the slide demand an excessive cognitive load for learners, specifically learners with dyslexia, and they have 3 main features in common. First, the activities require real-time language processing. In other words, the student has to be able to process information quickly in order to carry out the task. This causes a conflict because, as we signaled before, learners with dyslexia struggle particularly with the speed of processing. Second, in order to carry out this task, the learner has to rely on previous knowledge in terms of automatized skill or memorized vocabulary and expressions. Again, as we mentioned in the slide where we define dyslexia, this is an area of challenge for dyslexic learners. Third, and this is probably the one that presents the biggest challenge, all of the activities are multitask. In other words, the students have to activate several skills at the same time. And some of those skills are skills that should be automatic for learners without dyslexia. Taking notes, for example, even in your first language, is a good example. When you take notes, you are listening and you are processing the information in your head and you are producing the language. As a part of this conversation, we have to now talk about what contributes to each individual's language aptitude. In other words, the factors that make someone a successful language learner. Research has shown us that there are 4 main factors that are relevant here. First one, perceiving sounds and associating them with graphemes. In other words, the ability to decode the written word in a foreign language. The second factor is recognizing grammatical functions of words or phrases. Now, learning associations between sounds and meaning, which is directly related to listening comprehension, and inferring grammar rules without explicit training. Now, all of these factors, for the reasons described before, cause learners with dyslexia to have a harder time becoming successful language learners. However, as educators, it's very important that we are aware that not all unsuccessful language learners suffer dyslexia, and the reverse is also true. This brings us to the third part of this presentation, talking about what we as teachers can do to support our learners with dyslexia. In order to do that, we are going to take a step back and consider the levels of interaction that are essential to successful learning. There's a model by Michael Moore from 1989 that indicates that there are 3 essential types of learner interaction. Interaction of the learner with the content that is being taught, interaction from the learner with the teacher that's facilitating the content, and interaction between the learner and his peers. I would like to zoom in now on the interaction between the learner and the content that is being taught. We already know from before that dyslexia can affect language learning on a number of levels. Now, in this picture, if you consider that each one of the arrows represents one aspect of language, for example, comprehension skills, decoding skills, memorization and retrieval of vocabulary, and reflections upon the language, you can see how some of those areas may be intact, while others may be broken due to the learning difference. This is what we have to consider before implementing any adaptations for our dyslexic students. With this in mind, we will introduce the concept of accessible language teaching. Essentially, with accessible language teaching, what we're talking about is creating a barrier-free language learning environment so that students with learning differences can become successful learners. These adaptations can be done in 2 levels, the micro level and the macro level. At the macro level, we're going to talk about adaptations or methodological choices that are done in general and have an impact in the whole language course. At the micro level, we're talking about specific interventions to maximize the accessibility of single units of the language course. Even though the number of adaptations that can be done to facilitate the process for learners with dyslexia, in this session we will only discuss 2. One that is relevant for young learners and their teachers, that has to do with working with sounds and letters, and the second one that is relevant for learners of all ages and has to do with the development of skills. Let's begin with the first one, working with sounds and letters. The majority of mainstream primary classrooms work with some variety of the communicative approach. Learners are encouraged to take part in activities for learning basic communicative functions. For example, they introduce themselves, or they ask for the time, they ask about the weather. And generally, the communicative approach for primary learners is applied in a playful way, using games, nursery rhymes, and stories to introduce the language. However, the challenge for teachers and learners with dyslexia at this moment is that this approach does not take into consideration 2 main aspects. The first factor is explicit work on English sounds, some of which will be new to the learners because they are not present in their mother tongue. The second factor is the gradual contact with the written code. This is important because English is a very orthographically deep language. In other words, the English sounds a lot of the times deviate from those on one-to-one letter and sound correspondence. By the time we start talking about developing the language skills, we have to go back to earlier in this session where we explained that language ability consists of various skills that involve bottom-up and top-down processes. The skills that involve bottom-up processes are called technical skills. One example of this is decoding a letter while reading a text. Skills that involve top-down processes are strategic skills. For example, choosing the correct reading strategy according to the type of text that we are reading. Making this distinction is very important because for learners with dyslexia, they often struggle with the technical skills. And the technical skills, in turn, cause a setback for the strategic skills. Let's consider the work that we do in our classes with the oral skills, in other words, listening and speaking. In terms of listening, one of the challenges that we mentioned in the slide where we talked about the type of tasks that we usually assign our learners, we mentioned that one of the challenges is that those activities require the use of multiple skills at once. So, whenever you are assigning listening skills to your students, you should consider breaking up the tasks into smaller units that have a single objective. In those activities, always make time to pre-teach the vocabulary and start working with global comprehension and move towards detailed comprehension of the text. Always give priority to context over specific figures of the language. Similarly, when we're developing the speaking skill, we should give priority to communicative and linguistic resources. Every time you assign practice to the students, you should give preference to free practice over controlled practice because following specific structures and patterns may be harder for your learners with dyslexia. Last but not least, you should promote interaction skills that help your learners compensate for any weaknesses in the production of the language. The adaptations that are suggested for the written skills are very similar to what we have seen before. Whenever your students are reading a text for the first time, try and provide them with auditory as well as visual input. A lot of textbooks include audio recordings of the written text that you can use to your students' advantage. Pre-teaching the vocabulary will make it easier for your students when they are presented with the text. Consider making adaptations in terms of the layout. Something as simple as changing the font, the size or the contrast of the written page will make it easier for your students to face the reading tasks. Last but not least, consider making your students aware of before, while, and after reading strategies that will help them perform better in these kind of tasks. When the time comes for your students to work on producing written text, always grade the tasks carefully. Start by asking them to produce shorter texts and gradually progress towards longer texts. Make accommodations in the types of tasks that you are asking the students to perform. Introduce the notion of shared writing and consider training your students in text planning. Now I just want to leave you with some final thoughts. We have to bear in mind that dyslexic thinking has strengths. Learners with dyslexia are holistic thinkers. They see the big picture, they make new connections. They are creative, they have good 3D spatial reasoning, they succeed in the arts, become entrepreneurs, or work in areas that require innovative thinking. It's important for us, it is our responsibility for us teachers, educators, teacher trainers, to work with these strengths with our students, to allow them with opportunities to engage in creative big picture thinking. As English teachers in particular, we have the privilege of working with a curriculum that provides plenty of scope for our students to engage in projects, problem-solving activities, drama, and stories. It is our responsibility to do so. And at the end of the day, regardless of everything I've said today, if I can only leave you with one takeaway, is that you, each one of you, has great influence over these learners' lives. You don't need to be a specialist, but you do need to provide the students with the support, the time, and the encouragement they need to understand why they're having these issues and how to overcome them. I will leave you with a story from not that long ago. There was a student that was described by his teachers as mentally slow, unsociable, and often getting lost in his own dreams. This student was dyslexic, and his name is Albert Einstein. We need dyslexic learners. Let's embrace them and let's help them flourish. I will now take 10 minutes to answer your questions. Please write them in the chat box and I'll do my best to answer them. I would like to thank everyone for their interest and participation. My name is Gloria Montiel, and I am very proud to work for Oxford University Press. Thank you, Mex Diesel.